Chapter 1. The Dream of the New World. Roanoke Colony, 1587. Welcome to this journey into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing where these documented accounts reach across the world, because what you are about to hear is not legend. It is not folklore embellished over centuries. This is documented history, real people, real events, and a disappearance so complete, so inexplicable, that 438 years later, we still do not know what happened. In the summer of 1587, 117 English colonists arrived on a small island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They came seeking a new life, a fresh start, an opportunity to build something lasting in the new world. Among them were 17 women, 11 children, and 90 men. These were not soldiers sent on military missions. These were families, real families with hopes and dreams and plans for the future. By August of 1590, they had vanished. Every single person, gone without a trace. No bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of what had happened to them. The only clue left behind was a single word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, and it begins not with disappearance, but with hope. To understand why 117 people would risk everything to travel to an unknown land across a dangerous ocean, we must understand England in the 1580s. Queen Elizabeth I ruled a nation on the rise but struggling with overcrowding, religious conflict, and economic uncertainty. The Spanish Empire controlled vast territories in the New World, territories producing enormous wealth from gold, silver, and trade. England wanted its share, but more importantly, ordinary English citizens wanted opportunity. Land, freedom, a chance to build something that was theirs. Sir Walter Raleigh, one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites, obtained a charter in 1584 to establish colonies in North America. He funded expeditions to explore the coast, searching for a suitable location. In 1585, an expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville established the first Roanoke colony, a military outpost of about 107 men on Roanoke Island, located in the Outer Banks of present-day North Carolina. That first colony failed. Conflicts with local Native American tribes, shortages of supplies, and harsh conditions led to its abandonment in 1586, when Sir Francis Drake arrived and evacuated the surviving colonists back to England. But Raleigh refused to give up on his vision. He planned a new colony. Not a military outpost this time, but a permanent settlement. Families, women and children, people committed to building a lasting community in the New World. In 1587, Raleigh assembled his colonists. He appointed John White, an artist and mapmaker who had participated in the earlier expeditions, as governor of the new colony. White was in his early 50s, experienced, capable, and deeply invested in the success of the venture. His daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare were among the colonists. Eleanor was pregnant. Their child would be the first English child born in North America. The colonists departed England in May 1587 aboard 3 ships. The voyage across the Atlantic took over 2 months. Grueling weeks of cramped conditions, limited food, constant seasickness, and the ever-present fear of storms or Spanish attack. But they persevered, sustained by hope for what awaited them. On July 22, 1587, they arrived at Roanoke Island. Roanoke Island is a small strip of land, approximately 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, located in the Outer Banks between the Atlantic Ocean and the mainland. It is covered with dense forests of pine and oak. The climate is temperate but humid. Mosquitoes swarm in summer. Storms sweep in from the ocean with terrifying regularity. The soil is sandy and challenging for agriculture, but it had advantages. It was defensible. It had access to fresh water. It was near Native American villages where trade might be possible. And most importantly, it offered protection from Spanish ships prowling the coast. When the colonists arrived in July 1587, they found the remains of the 1585 fort. Most of the structures had been burned or torn down, either by retreating English colonists or by hostile natives. But some buildings could be repaired. Immediately, the colonists set to work. They rebuilt structures. They cleared land for planting. They established relationships, or attempted to, with the nearby Native American tribes. John White, as governor, organized work details, managed supplies, and planned for the colony's future. On August 18, 1587, less than a month after arrival, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Virginia, after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth, and the territory they hoped to claim for England. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the Americas. Her birth was celebrated as a sign of hope, proof that English people could not only survive, but thrive in the New World. But beneath the celebration, serious problems were emerging. The colonists had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. The supplies they brought from England were insufficient to sustain 117 people through the coming winter. Relations with the local Native American tribes were tense. The previous English colonists had committed acts of violence against the natives, and those grievances had not been forgotten. Moreover, the colony's location was proving problematic. Roanoke Island's sandy soil was not ideal for farming. Freshwater sources were limited. The island was vulnerable to storms sweeping in from the Atlantic. And most concerning, the colonists were hundreds of miles from any other English presence, completely isolated and dependent on ships from England for additional supplies and communication. Governor John White recognized these problems. In late August 1587, barely a month after the colony's establishment, he called a meeting of the colony's leaders. The decision they reached would have devastating consequences, though they could not know it at the time. Someone needed to return to England immediately to secure additional supplies and request reinforcements. The colony's survival depended on it. And that person needed to be someone the investors and authorities in England would trust. Someone who could convincingly describe the colony's situation and potential. The colonists chose John White. As governor and an experienced sailor and navigator, he was the logical choice. But White resisted. His daughter and newborn granddaughter were in the colony. How could he leave them? What if something went wrong during his absence? The colonists insisted. White's daughter, Eleanor, supposedly urged him to go, arguing that the colony's best chance of survival was for him to bring back supplies quickly. Reluctantly, White agreed. On August 27, 1587, just 9 days after Virginia Dare's birth, he boarded a ship bound for England. As the ship pulled away from Roanoke Island, White stood on deck, watching the colony grow smaller in the distance. His daughter, his granddaughter, his friends and fellow colonists. He promised to return quickly. 2 months, 3 at most. He would bring supplies, additional colonists, everything they needed. It was the last time anyone would see the Roanoke colonists alive. John White's plan to return quickly was immediately derailed. When he reached England in November 1587, he found the nation in crisis. Tensions with Spain had escalated dramatically. King Philip II of Spain was assembling an enormous fleet, the Spanish Armada, intended to invade England and overthrow Queen Elizabeth. Every English ship was being commandeered for defense. No vessels could be spared for colonial resupply missions. White pleaded with investors and authorities. He described the colony's desperate situation. He explained that his own family was among those awaiting relief. Nothing mattered. England was preparing for war. The colonies would have to wait. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed for England. 130 ships, carrying over 30,000 men. The English Navy, led by Sir Francis Drake and other legendary commanders, defeated the Armada in a series of battles that saved England from invasion. But the war with Spain continued. English ships remained mobilized. Colonial ventures remained suspended. White managed to arrange 2 small ships to depart for Roanoke in April 1588. But the crews, more interested in piracy than colonization, attacked French ships, got into battles, and were forced to return to England without ever reaching Roanoke. White had failed. Throughout 1588 and 1589, White desperately sought passage to Roanoke. He wrote letters. He petitioned investors. He offered to pay from his own resources. But no one would help. The war consumed all resources and attention. A handful of colonists in a remote location were not a priority. Finally, in March 1590, White secured passage on a privateering expedition, commanded by John Watts. The expedition's primary purpose was attacking Spanish ships and settlements, but Watts agreed to make a stop at Roanoke. It was not ideal, but it was White's only option. It had been 2.5 years since White had left Roanoke. 2.5 years since he had seen his daughter and granddaughter. 2.5 years during which the colonists had been completely isolated, with no supplies, no communication, no support from England. As the ships sailed toward the North Carolina coast in August 1590, White must have felt crushing anxiety. Would he find the colony still there? Would they have survived? Would they be angry at him for failing to return, as promised? Would his granddaughter Virginia even remember him? On August 15, 1590, the ships arrived off the coast of Roanoke Island. It was 3 years almost to the day since White had departed. As they approached, crew members scanned the shore for signs of the colony. Smoke from fires, movement of people, ships at anchor, anything. They saw nothing. The island appeared deserted. White insisted on going ashore immediately, despite approaching darkness. On the evening of August 15th, a small boat rowed toward the island. As they neared the shore, sailors played a trumpet and sang English songs, hoping to attract the colonists' attention. But no one came to greet them. The forest remained silent. The boat returned to the ships. They would land in the morning, in full daylight, when they could see clearly. White spent that night unable to sleep, staring toward the dark shape of Roanoke Island, wondering what awaited him there. On the morning of August 16, 1590, John White led a landing party ashore at Roanoke Island. They approached cautiously, watching for any signs of the colonists or potential danger. The beach was empty, no boats, no people, no indication that anyone had been there recently. They moved inland toward where the colony settlement had been established. The forest was overgrown, vegetation reclaiming paths that had been cleared 3 years earlier. White recognized landmarks, this tree, that rock formation, the shape of the shoreline. But everything seemed wrong, too quiet, too empty. And then they saw it. A wooden palisade, a defensive wall made of logs, that had not been there when White left in 1587. The colonists had fortified the settlement. This suggested they had faced threats, had prepared for attack. But where were they? The landing party approached the palisade entrance, and there, carved into a wooden post, was a single word in capital letters: Croatoan. White stared at the carving. His heart raced. What did it mean? The colonists had agreed before White's departure that if they needed to leave the settlement, they would carve the name of their destination. And if they left under duress or attack, they would carve a cross above the name as a signal of danger. There was no cross, only the word, Croatoan. The landing party entered the palisade. Inside they found abandoned structures. Some buildings had been taken down in an orderly way, the timbers removed, suggesting the colonists had dismantled them deliberately rather than fleeing in panic. Personal items remained scattered, a few tools, broken pottery, remnants of daily life. But no people, no bodies, no signs of violence or struggle. The colony was empty. White searched desperately for any additional clues. And near the entrance, carved into a tree, he found 3 letters: C-R-O, Croatoan. That was the name of an island about 50 miles south, now called Hatteras Island. And it was also the name of a Native American tribe that had been friendly to the earlier English expeditions. Had the colonists gone there? Had they joined the Croatoan people? White wanted to search immediately, to sail to Croatoan Island and find his daughter and granddaughter. But Captain Watts refused. A storm was approaching. The ships needed to return to deeper water to avoid being driven onto the treacherous shoals of the Outer Banks. They would return, Watts promised, as soon as the weather cleared. But the storm proved severe. It damaged one of the ships and depleted their supplies of fresh water. Watts made the decision to abandon the search and return to England. Despite White's pleas, despite his desperate insistence that his family was somewhere nearby, waiting to be found, the expedition departed. John White never returned to North America. He never found his daughter Eleanor. He never saw his granddaughter Virginia again. He died in England around 1593, probably never knowing what happened to the colonists he had left behind. And for 438 years, no one else has known either. The lost colony of Roanoke remains one of history's greatest mysteries. 117 people vanished, and all we have is a single word carved into wood: Croatoan. Chapter 2. The Croatoan Connection, Allies, Enemies, and the Word that Changed Everything. When John White discovered the word Croatoan carved into that wooden post in August 1590, he understood immediately what it might mean. But to understand why that single word has haunted historians for more than 4 centuries, we must understand the complex relationship between the English colonists and the Native American tribes of coastal North Carolina in the 1580s. This is not a simple story of colonists versus natives. It is a story of alliances and betrayals, of friendship and violence, of misunderstanding across cultural divides. And most crucially, it is a story of one Native American man whose loyalty to the English may have saved the colonists' lives, even as it erased them from English records forever. His name was Manteo, and he is the key to understanding what happened to the lost colony. The story of Roanoke actually begins in 1584, 3 years before the ill-fated colony was established. That year, Philip Amatus and Arthur Barlow led an exploratory expedition to the North Carolina coast on behalf of Sir Walter Raleigh. Their mission was to find a suitable location for an English colony and to establish relationships with the local Native American tribes. When they arrived, they encountered several distinct tribal groups living in the region. The largest and most powerful were the Secatan people, who controlled much of the mainland. On the Outer Banks themselves lived smaller groups, including the Roanoke tribe on Roanoke Island and the Croatoan people on what is now Hatteras Island, about 50 miles south. These tribes were not one unified people. They had different leaders, different territories, and sometimes conflicting interests. Understanding these distinctions is crucial to understanding what happened later. Amadas and Barlow met with tribal leaders and were received initially with cautious hospitality. The natives were curious about these strange visitors with their massive ships and unusual technology. The English were fascinated by the Native Americans, their appearance, their customs, their way of life. Crucially, Amadas and Barlow brought 2 Native Americans back to England with them, Wanchese, a member of the Secatan tribe, and Manteo, whose mother Wayapemka was the chieftain of the Croatoan people on Croatoan Island. This decision would have profound consequences. Wanchese and Manteo spent nearly a year in England. They learned English. They met Queen Elizabeth. They saw London, a city whose population of 200,000 was larger than anything they could have imagined. They witnessed English technology, military power, and culture. But the 2 men responded to this experience very differently. Manteo was impressed by the English and apparently saw potential benefit in alliance with them. Wanchese grew increasingly suspicious and hostile, recognizing that English colonization threatened his people's way of life. In 1585, Wanchese and Manteo returned to North America aboard Sir Richard Grenville's expedition, which established the first Roanoke colony, a military outpost of about 107 men under the command of Ralph Lane. Manteo remained loyal to the English, serving as interpreter and advisor. Wanchese immediately rejoined his Secatan people and became one of the English colony's most vocal opponents. The 1585 colony was a disaster. Lane and his men were soldiers, not farmers. They depended heavily on the local tribes for food, but offered little in return. They made demands. They were arrogant. And when they suspected the Secatan chief Wingina of plotting against them, Lane led a preemptive attack that killed Wingina and several other tribal leaders. This act of violence poisoned relationships between the English and most of the local Native American tribes. When the colonists abandoned Roanoke in 1586 and returned to England, they left behind a legacy of mistrust and hostility that would haunt future colonial efforts. But Manteo and the Croatoan people remained friendly to the English. This distinction is crucial. The Croatoans were not the same as the Secatans or Roanokes. They lived separately on Croatoan Island. They had their own leadership. And for reasons that historians still debate, perhaps strategic calculation, perhaps genuine friendship, perhaps something else, they maintained their alliance with the English even after other tribes had turned hostile. When John White returned in 1587 to establish the new colony, Manteo came with him. By this point, Manteo had been to England twice. He spoke fluent English. He understood both English and Native American cultures. He was, in many ways, uniquely positioned to mediate between the two worlds. White valued Manteo immensely. Shortly after arriving at Roanoke in July 1587, White made an extraordinary decision. He formally baptized Manteo as a Christian and named him Lord of Roanoke and Dassamunkapuk, granting him authority over territories that had belonged to the now hostile Roanoke tribe. This was a political move as much as a religious one. White was attempting to create a Native American ally with official English authority, someone who could negotiate with other tribes, mediate conflicts, and help the colony survive. But it also created complications. Other tribes likely viewed Manteo as a collaborator or traitor. The English had killed Native American leaders. They had seized land. And now they were attempting to install one of their own people, a Croatoan who had adopted English ways, as a lord over territories that didn't belong to him. The situation was tense and unstable. The colonists faced hostility from most local tribes. They had limited supplies. They were hundreds of miles from any English support. And their primary Native American ally was himself, a member of a relatively small tribe with limited military power. This was the situation when John White departed for England on August 27, 1587, leaving behind 117 colonists, including Manteo, the only Native American known to have remained with the colony. What happened during the 3 years between White's departure in August 1587 and his return in August 1590? We have no English records, no diaries, no letters. The colonists were completely isolated, unable to communicate with England. But we can make educated guesses based on what we know about the situation. First, supplies would have been critically low. The colonists arrived too late in the season to plant substantial crops. They would have needed to obtain food from Native American tribes, but most of those tribes were hostile. The Croatoans were friendly, but their island was 50 miles away by water. Regular trade would have been difficult and dangerous. Second, the colony's defensive situation was poor. Roanoke Island could be approached by water from multiple directions. If hostile tribes wanted to attack, the colonists would have struggled to defend themselves. The palisade wall that White found in 1590 had not existed when he left in 1587, suggesting the colonists built it in response to threats. Third, disease was always a risk. European diseases like smallpox and measles were devastating to Native American populations who had no immunity. But disease could also strike the English colonists, particularly in the unfamiliar climate with limited medical knowledge. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the colonists must have realized that White was not returning as quickly as promised. After 1 year, by August 1588, they would have known something had gone wrong. After 2 years, they would have understood they were on their own. At some point during these 3 years, the colonists made a decision. They would leave Roanoke Island, and they would leave a message telling anyone who came looking where they had gone. That message was a single word: Croatoan. The choice of Croatoan as the message tells us several important things. First, it indicates the colonists' relationship with Manteo and the Croatoan people had remained strong. If the colonists feared or distrusted the Croatoans, they would not have announced they were going there. Second, it suggests the move was planned and orderly. The agreed-upon signal system was that distress would be indicated by a Maltese cross carved above the destination name. There was no cross, only the word Croatoan. This implies the colonists left voluntarily, not fleeing from attack or disaster. Third, the partial carving CRO on a nearby tree suggests someone was in the process of carving additional messages when they had to stop. Why? We don't know, but it indicates some urgency or interruption. Fourth, the dismantled buildings and removed possessions suggest the colonists took their belongings with them. They weren't abandoning everything in panic. They were relocating. So what happened? The most likely scenario, supported by the evidence, goes something like this. The colonists, realizing White was not returning and facing increasing difficulties on Roanoke Island, accepted an invitation from Manteo to relocate to Croatoan Island, where his people lived. This would solve several problems. The Croatoans were friendly. They knew how to live off the land. They could provide food, security, and local knowledge that the English lacked. The colonists carefully dismantled their buildings to salvage useful materials. They carved Croatoan into the post as a message for any English ships that might eventually arrive. And then they traveled the 50 miles south to Croatoan Island. But here's where the story becomes more complex. Because Croatoan Island is not where the colonists ultimately stayed. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that the Croatoan people themselves were in the process of migrating inland during this period. The reasons are unclear, but likely included resource depletion on the island, conflicts with other tribes, or strategic repositioning. If the English colonists joined the Croatoans, and the evidence suggests they did, then they would have participated in this migration. Over time, the combined English-Croatoan group moved west, away from the coast, into the interior of what is now North Carolina. This would explain several mysteries. It explains why searches of Croatoan Island in subsequent years found no trace of the colonists. They had already moved inland. It explains the later reports by English explorers of Native Americans with European features, speaking some English words, living in the interior. And it explains why no mass grave or battlefield was ever discovered. Because the colonists didn't die. They assimilated. This theory is supported by archaeological evidence discovered in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, excavations in areas known to have been inhabited by Croatoan descendants, have uncovered English artifacts, gunflints, sword hilts, pieces of armor, dated to the late 16th century. These objects would have been valuable and carefully preserved, consistent with them being heirlooms passed down through families. Genetic studies of the Lumbee people of North Carolina, who claim descent from a mixture of Native American and early English settlers, show markers consistent with European ancestry dating to approximately the right time period. And documentary evidence from the early 1600s mentions English explorers hearing stories from Native Americans about light-skinned, English-speaking people living in the interior, people who knew about houses built with stone, and books, and other English cultural elements. So did the Roanoke colonists die or disappear mysteriously? Probably not. Did they assimilate into the Croatoan people and gradually lose their distinct English identity through intermarriage and cultural adaptation? The evidence strongly suggests yes. This doesn't mean every single colonist survived. Disease, childbirth complications, accidents, and conflicts could have claimed lives over the years. Virginia Dare, born in August 1587, would have been only 3 years old when White returned in 1590. Her survival into adulthood was far from guaranteed, given infant mortality rates of the era. But the bulk of the colonists, men, women, and children, likely lived for years or even decades after White's departure. They probably married into Croatoan families. They probably had children of mixed English and Native American heritage. They probably taught some English words and customs to their adopted community. And gradually, over 1 or 2 generations, their distinct English identity faded, absorbed into a hybrid culture. Manteo probably played a crucial role in facilitating this assimilation. As someone who understood both cultures, spoke both languages, and had connections to both the English colonists and the Croatoan leadership, he was uniquely positioned to help the colonists integrate into Native American society. But we will never know for certain. No diary survived documenting this process. No letter was ever written explaining what happened. The colonists simply faded into a different world, a world that kept no written records. For John White, the uncertainty was torturous. He spent the last years of his life not knowing whether his daughter and granddaughter were alive or dead. In his final written account, composed around 1593, he expressed his anguish. "I greatly joyed that I had safely found a certain token of their safe being at Croatoan, which is the place where Manteo was born, and the savages of the island our friends." White believed his family had gone to Croatoan. He believed they were with friendly people, but he never got confirmation. He never found them, and he died not knowing. This is perhaps the real tragedy of the lost colony. Not that the colonists died mysteriously, but that they lived, survived, adapted, and built new lives in a way that made them invisible to English record keepers. They crossed a cultural boundary that, once crossed, could not easily be recrossed, and so they became lost, not to death, but to history. Chapter 3. The Evidence Speaks: Archaeology, DNA, and the Search for Descendants. For more than 300 years after John White's desperate search in 1590, the fate of the Roanoke colonists remained a matter of speculation and legend. Stories circulated, theories were proposed, but there was no hard evidence, no scientific investigation, no archaeological proof. That changed in the 20th century. Beginning in the 1930s and accelerating dramatically in the 1990s and 2000s, archaeologists, geneticists, and historians began applying modern scientific methods to the mystery. What they discovered didn't provide simple answers, but it provided something perhaps more valuable: tangible evidence that the colonists didn't simply vanish into thin air. They left traces, physical traces, genetic traces, cultural traces. This is the story of how science began solving a 400-year-old mystery, and of how the descendants of the lost colony may be living among us today. The first systematic archaeological investigation of Roanoke Island occurred in 1938, led by J.C. Harrington of the National Park Service. Harrington's team excavated the site of the original 1585-1587 fort and uncovered fascinating artifacts: fragments of pottery, pieces of armor, gun flints, glass beads intended for trade with Native Americans. These objects confirmed the location of the settlement and provided insight into the colonists' daily lives. But Harrington found no mass grave, no sign of a battlefield or massacre, no evidence of what had happened to the 117 people who had lived there. For decades, archaeological attention focused on Roanoke Island itself. But in the 1990s, researchers began to shift their attention to other locations, places the colonists might have gone after leaving Roanoke. The most promising site was Croatoan Island, now called Hatteras Island. In 1998, archaeologist David Phelps from East Carolina University launched a long-term excavation project in the Buxton area of Hatteras Island, near where the historical Croatoan village had been located. What Phelps and his team found was extraordinary. They discovered a site containing both Native American and English artifacts mixed together in the same archaeological layers. This wasn't evidence of simple trade, Native Americans obtaining English goods through exchange. This was evidence of cohabitation, English people and Croatoan people living in the same location at the same time, using the same spaces. The artifacts included gunflints, pieces of broken sword hilts, copper fragments worked into Native American decorative objects, and, most strikingly, a signet ring bearing the symbol of a lion. Signet rings were personal items used to seal important documents. They were valuable and would have been carefully preserved. Finding one in a Native American village site suggested it had been passed down as an heirloom, exactly what you would expect if an English colonist had married into a Croatoan family. Carbon dating of the artifacts placed them in the late 16th to early 17th century, precisely the period when the Roanoke colonists would have been living with the Croatoan people. But the Hatteras Island discoveries weren't the only archaeological breakthrough. In 2012, researchers examining 2 maps from the John White collection at the British Museum made a startling discovery. Both maps contained small patches, corrections made by gluing new pieces of paper over portions of the original map. This was common practice when cartographers needed to correct errors. But when researchers used X-ray imaging to look beneath these patches, they found hidden markings. On both maps, in the same location approximately 50 miles inland from Roanoke, was a symbol, a small star or fort mark. This suggested White had marked a potential location for the colony's relocation, somewhere on the Albemarle Sound, near modern-day Edenton, North Carolina. Why would White have hidden this mark beneath patches? One theory is that he concealed it for security reasons. If Spanish forces captured the maps, they shouldn't be able to find the colony's location. The marks were visible in the original, but hidden in copies. Following this clue, archaeologists began investigating the area around the Salmon Creek on the Albemarle Sound. In 2015, the First Colony Foundation announced they had discovered a site containing European artifacts dating to the late 16th century, including pottery fragments, hinges, and pieces of a gun. This suggested a stunning possibility. The colonists might have split into groups. Some went south to Croatoan Island with Manteo. Others went inland to establish a second settlement in a more secure location with better agricultural potential. If true, this would explain why searches focused on a single location never found the colonists. They weren't in one place. They had dispersed, a sensible survival strategy for a small, vulnerable population. While archaeologists excavated sites, geneticists launched a different kind of search, looking for the colonists' descendants in the DNA of modern populations. The most extensive effort has focused on the Lumbee people of southeastern North Carolina. The Lumbee are one of the largest Native American tribes in the eastern United States, with approximately 55,000 enrolled members. But unlike most recognized tribes, the Lumbee don't have a reservation and don't share a single traditional language. Their origins have long been mysterious. Lumbee oral traditions assert that their ancestors included people from the Roanoke colony. According to these traditions, English colonists intermarried with Croatoan people, and their descendants migrated inland over generations, eventually settling in what is now Robeson County, North Carolina. Supporting this tradition are several striking pieces of historical evidence. When English colonists first encountered the Lumbee in the early 1700s, they noted several peculiarities. Many tribal members had European features, including blue or gray eyes and lighter skin. Many bore English surnames, Dare, Cooper, Bailey, that matched names on the Roanoke colonist roster. And many spoke English words and practiced Christian customs despite never having been missionized by European churches. One particularly intriguing piece of folklore concerns a grave in Robeson County, near the town of Pembroke, traditionally identified as belonging to Virginia Dare. According to Lumbee tradition, this is the resting place of the first English child born in America, who lived to adulthood, married into the Croatoan Lumbee people, and died among them many decades later. But folklore and oral tradition, however compelling, are not scientific proof. In 2007, the Lost Colony DNA Project was launched to test these claims using genetic evidence. The project's approach was elegant. Collect DNA samples from modern Lumbee people and from descendants of known English families from the 1580s. Then compare the two to look for genetic markers that would indicate shared ancestry. Particular attention focused on mitochondrial DNA, which is passed directly from mother to daughter, with minimal changes over generations. If Eleanor Dare, or any of the other English women from Roanoke, had female descendants who eventually became part of the Lumbee tribe, that mitochondrial DNA signature should still be detectable in modern Lumbee women. The results were complicated. Genetic testing showed that modern Lumbee people do indeed have European ancestry. Studies found that approximately 5 to 10% of Lumbee DNA comes from European sources, consistent with some degree of English admixture occurring centuries ago, but proving that this European DNA specifically came from the Roanoke colonists, rather than from later English settlers, traders, or others proved extremely difficult. DNA degrades over time. Genealogical records for 16th century English families are incomplete, and 400 years of intermixing has blurred genetic signals. However, some intriguing findings emerged. Certain Lumbee family lines showed genetic markers more consistent with 16th century English populations than with later immigrant groups, and the distribution of these markers within the Lumbee population suggested they entered the gene pool at a specific historical moment, consistent with the timing of the Roanoke colony. Most significantly, some Lumbee families carry specific European surname DNA markers, genetic signatures associated with particular family names, that match surnames from the Roanoke colonist roster. A man named Samson Dare, living among the Lumbee in the 1700s, carried genetic markers suggesting descent from the Dare family line, potentially a direct descendant of Eleanor and Ananias Dare. The evidence isn't conclusive. Scientists are careful to say that DNA testing suggests but does not prove Roanoke ancestry for some Lumbee families, but it's strongly suggestive, and it aligns with both the oral traditions and the archaeological evidence. Beyond archaeology and genetics, linguistic analysis provided another piece of the puzzle. In the 1990s, linguist Walt Wolfram from North Carolina State University conducted an extensive study of Lumbee speech patterns. Wolfram discovered that Lumbee English contains unusual grammatical structures and pronunciation patterns not found in surrounding dialects. Some of these patterns appear to be archaic, forms of English that were common in the 16th and 17th centuries, but have since disappeared from modern English. For example, Lumbee speakers sometimes use weren't as a past tense form of be in ways that match 16th century English usage, but don't match modern Standard English or even modern regional Southern dialects. They also preserve certain pronunciation patterns, particularly regarding vowel sounds, that linguistic analysis suggests are remnants of Elizabethan-era English. How would such archaic English patterns survive in an isolated Native American community for 400 years? The most plausible explanation is that English speakers integrated into the community in the late 16th or early 17th century, taught their language to their children and the broader community, and those linguistic patterns were preserved even as the actual English identity faded. This doesn't prove the Lumbee descend from Roanoke colonists. English traders and settlers came to the region throughout the 1600s, but it supports the scenario of early English integration into native communities at approximately the right time period. Historical documents from the early 1600s provide additional tantalizing clues. In 1607, just 17 years after John White's failed search, English colonists established Jamestown in Virginia, about 150 miles north of Roanoke. Jamestown colonists made numerous attempts to locate the Roanoke survivors. Captain John Smith, the famous Jamestown leader, wrote in 1608 that he had heard reports from local Native Americans of people like us living inland, near the Chowan River. Smith's informants described these people as having white skin and living in two-storied houses, a distinctly English architectural feature. Smith also reported hearing about a massacre. Approximately 1607, the Powhatan chief supposedly killed a group of English people living among a tribe to the south. This might have been a group of Roanoke survivors, or it might have been unrelated. In 1709, English surveyor John Lawson visited Native American villages in the North Carolina interior and met people he believed were descended from the Roanoke colonists. Lawson wrote, "Several of their ancestors were white people and could talk in a book, as we do, the truth of which is confirmed by gray eyes being found frequently amongst these Indians and no others." Talk in a book, meaning they were literate, was something that would have been passed down from English colonists who could read and write, a skill extremely rare among Native Americans of that era. These documentary sources aren't proof. They're secondhand reports, often written years after the supposed events. But they create a pattern. Throughout the 1600s and early 1700s, English explorers repeatedly encountered Native American communities in the North Carolina interior that showed evidence of English ancestry, exactly what we would expect if Roanoke colonists had integrated into those communities. Perhaps the most emotionally powerful element of the Lost Colony story is Virginia Dare herself, the infant born on August 18, 1587, the first English child in the Americas. Did she survive? Did she grow to adulthood among the Croatoan or Lumbee people? Did she have children who carried her bloodline forward? We will almost certainly never know for sure, but the persistence of her name in Lumbee oral tradition, the supposed grave site in Robeson County, and the presence of Dare as a surname among Lumbee families all suggest her story didn't end as a 3-year-old lost in the wilderness. In the 19th century, Virginia Dare became a romantic symbol, sometimes portrayed as a white princess raised by Native Americans, sometimes as a tragic victim, sometimes as a bridge between cultures. These romantic portrayals often revealed more about 19th century American anxieties about race and identity than about historical truth. But beneath the romanticism is a genuine human question. What happened to that baby? Where did she live her life? Did she remember her English heritage, or did she grow up fully Croatoan? Did she marry? Did she have children? If the genetic and archaeological evidence is correct, the answer might be yes. Virginia Dare might have lived a full life, married, had children, and her descendants might walk among us today, carrying in their DNA a fragment of her mother Eleanor's genetic code, passed down through 16 generations of mothers and daughters. Despite all this evidence, archaeological, genetic, linguistic, and documentary, we still don't have complete certainty about what happened to every single Roanoke colonist. The evidence strongly suggests that the bulk of the colonists survived for at least some years after 1587. It suggests they split into groups, with some going to Croatoan Island and others going inland. It suggests they intermarried with Native American populations, and that their descendants form part of the modern Lumbee people and possibly other tribes. But we can't prove it beyond all doubt. We can't point to a specific Lumbee person and say with 100% certainty, "You are descended from Eleanor Dare," or "Your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was Ananias Dare." And that's perhaps appropriate. The lost colony earned its name not because the colonists died mysteriously, but because they crossed a boundary, cultural, ethnic, linguistic, that made them invisible to English record keepers. They became something new, neither fully English nor fully Native American, but a hybrid that didn't fit neatly into either category. In that sense, they remain lost even as evidence of their survival accumulates. Lost not to death, but to the categories and definitions we use to make sense of history. But they lived. Of that, the evidence is increasingly clear. They lived, they adapted, they survived. And in surviving, they became something their sponsors in England could never have imagined. The first English Americans to truly belong to the New World. Chapter 4. The Alternative Theories: Drought, Spanish Attack, and Disaster Scenarios. The theory that the Roanoke colonists integrated with the Croatoan people and survived through assimilation is compelling. It's supported by archaeological evidence, genetic data, linguistic patterns, and historical documents. But it's not the only theory. And importantly, it may not account for all 117 colonists. History is rarely simple. Human events unfold through combinations of causes, not single explanations. The fate of the lost colony may be more complex than any one theory suggests. Some colonists might have integrated with Native Americans. Others might have died from disease. Still others might have met violent ends. This chapter explores the alternative theories, some supported by evidence, some by speculation, and some by modern scientific analysis that has revealed shocking truths about the environment the colonists faced. What emerges is a picture not of a single catastrophic event, but of a colony struggling against multiple simultaneous threats, each capable of destroying them. In 1998, researchers from the University of Arkansas published a study that transformed understanding of the Roanoke mystery. Using dendrochronology, the analysis of tree ring growth patterns, scientists David Stale and his team reconstructed climate conditions in coastal North Carolina during the late 1580s. What they discovered was shocking. The years 1587-1589 experienced the most severe drought in the region in 800 years. Not just a bad drought, the worst drought in 8 centuries. Tree rings preserve a record of annual growth. In years with adequate rainfall, trees grow thick rings. In drought years, rings are thin. By analyzing ancient cypress trees from the Roanoke area that had lived through the 1580s, Stahl's team could precisely measure moisture levels during the colonists' critical first years. The data was unambiguous. Beginning in spring 1587, just as the colonists arrived, rainfall dropped dramatically and remained suppressed for 3 consecutive years. Streams would have run low or dry. Water sources the colonists depended on would have failed. And most critically, agriculture would have been nearly impossible. This drought had profound implications. The colonists arrived too late in 1587 to plant substantial crops. They planned to rely on supplies from England and food obtained from Native American tribes until they could establish self-sufficient agriculture the following spring. But spring 1588 brought drought. Any crops the colonists managed to plant would have withered. Any trade with Native Americans would have been complicated by the fact that native communities were also struggling with crop failures. The drought continued through 1588 and into 1589. For 3 years, the colonists would have faced chronic water shortages and food scarcity. Starvation becomes a real possibility. Desperation becomes understandable. But here's the crucial insight. This drought also affected Native American communities. The Croatoan people, living on a barrier island with limited freshwater sources, would have been particularly vulnerable. If they invited the English colonists to join them, it wasn't just an act of charity. It was potentially strategic alliance, combining resources and skills to survive a crisis that threatened everyone. The drought theory doesn't replace the assimilation theory. It enhances it. It explains why the colonists might have been willing to abandon their settlement and completely integrate into native society. When faced with starvation, cultural identity becomes less important than survival. In 1588, while John White was stranded in England, unable to return to Roanoke, Spain's global intelligence network was tracking English colonial efforts with great interest. Spain considered the entire Americas to be their territory, granted to them by the Pope. English colonies represented not just economic competition, but theological challenge. Protestant England defying Catholic Spain's divine mandate. Spanish records from the period document that Spanish officials knew about the Roanoke colony. They discussed destroying it. They considered it a strategic threat, a potential base from which English privateers could attack Spanish ships carrying gold and silver from the New World. In 1589, a Spanish expedition led by Vicente Gonzalez searched the North Carolina coast specifically looking for the English colony. Gonzalez's mission was to locate and destroy it. His fleet sailed along the Outer Banks, looking for English settlements. They found abandoned structures but no colonists. Did the Spanish find and attack the colony before Gonzalez's official search? Some historians have proposed this scenario. Perhaps a Spanish raid in 1588 killed or captured the colonists. Perhaps survivors fled, carving Croatoan as a message before dispersing. But there are significant problems with the Spanish attack theory. First, no Spanish records document such an attack. Spain meticulously recorded their military operations, especially successful ones against England. An attack that wiped out an English colony would have been celebrated and documented. Yet no such records exist. Second, the physical evidence at the abandoned Roanoke settlement showed no signs of battle. When John White arrived in 1590, he found no bodies, no bloodstains, no scattered weapons, no burned structures indicating combat. The settlement appeared to have been methodically dismantled, not hastily abandoned under attack. Third, the carefully carved Croatoan message suggests the colonists had time to leave instructions. People fleeing a Spanish attack wouldn't stop to carve elaborate messages. They would run. However, fear of Spanish attack might have influenced the colonists' decisions. Even without an actual attack, the threat of one could have motivated them to leave Roanoke Island, a known location marked on Spanish maps, for a more hidden inland settlement. This would explain the fort symbols on John White's hidden maps, secret relocation sites chosen specifically to avoid Spanish detection. The relationship between English colonists and Native American tribes was complex and volatile. The 1585 colony under Ralph Lane had committed acts of violence that poisoned relationships with several tribal groups. When the 1587 colonists arrived, they inherited these hostilities. One theory suggests the colonists became caught in intertribal conflicts they didn't fully understand. Native American political dynamics in the region involved shifting alliances, territorial disputes, and power struggles. The English, as outsiders, might have aligned with one group only to make enemies of others. Captain John Smith, writing from Jamestown in 1608, reported hearing about a massacre of English people by the Powhatan chief. According to Smith's Native American informants, Chief Powhatan had killed men, women, and children who lived among a tribe on the southern frontier of his territory, possibly remnants of the Roanoke colony. This report is intriguing but problematic. Smith's information was secondhand, collected 18 years after the colony's disappearance. The timeline doesn't clearly match, and Powhatan's territory didn't extend as far south as the areas where Roanoke colonists likely relocated. However, the broader point remains valid. Colonists who integrated into native communities could have been killed in conflicts unrelated to their English identity. If Roanoke colonists joined the Croatoan and then the Croatoan became involved in warfare with neighboring tribes, the English would have been caught in violence they had nothing to do with starting. This theory could explain why some colonists survived, those who stayed with peaceful communities or relocated inland, while others died, those who happened to be living with groups that became embroiled in conflict. Disease was a constant threat in the colonial era. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and typhus devastated Native American populations who lacked immunity. But disease also struck Europeans, especially in unfamiliar climates with limited medical knowledge. The colony's chief scientist, Thomas Harriot, kept detailed notes about illnesses affecting both English colonists and Native Americans during the 1585-1586 colony. He observed that English diseases spread rapidly among native populations, sometimes killing entire villages. But he also noted that English colonists fell ill from unfamiliar country diseases, probably malaria, dysentery, and other tropical or subtropical illnesses. In the brutally hot, humid summers of coastal North Carolina, with limited understanding of hygiene and disease transmission, illness could decimate a small population quickly. If key members of the colony died, leaders, skilled craftsmen, women of childbearing age, the community's viability could be catastrophically compromised. Combined with the severe drought, disease could have reduced the colony's population dramatically. Malnourished people are more susceptible to illness. Illness makes people less able to find food. The spiral can become deadly. This scenario doesn't preclude assimilation. Survivors of disease and starvation might have had even stronger motivation to join native communities that could provide food, medical knowledge, and social support. But it suggests the colony that left Roanoke Island might have been significantly reduced from the original 117 people. The most sophisticated modern theory suggests the colonists split into multiple groups, each facing different fates. This scenario integrates evidence of both southern, Croatoan Island, and inland, Albemarle Sound area, English presence. According to this theory, shortly after John White's departure, perhaps in late 1587 or early 1588, the colonists realized their situation was untenable. Supplies were insufficient. The drought was worsening. Hostile tribes threatened attack. The colony divided. One group, perhaps 30 to 40 people, including families with young children, accepted Manteo's invitation to relocate to Croatoan Island among his people. These colonists carved Croatoan as a message indicating where they had gone. They dismantled buildings to salvage materials, then migrated south. Meanwhile, a second group, perhaps 50-70 people including craftsmen, soldiers, and those willing to take greater risks for greater rewards, relocated inland to the Albemarle Sound area, where agricultural land was better and fresh water was more reliable. This group sought to establish a more conventional English settlement in a strategically hidden location. A third group, perhaps 10-20 people, might have stayed at or near Roanoke Island, maintaining the settlement in hopes that White would return with supplies. These colonists might have been killed by Spanish attack, hostile natives, or simply died of disease and starvation without leaving archaeological traces. This split colony theory explains several mysteries. It explains why archaeological evidence of English presence has been found in multiple locations. It explains why documentary sources describe English people in different areas. And it explains why no single theory completely accounts for all 117 colonists, because they didn't all share the same fate. Some theorists have proposed that natural disasters contributed to the colony's fate. The Outer Banks are extraordinarily vulnerable to hurricanes. A powerful storm in 1587, 1588, or 1589 could have destroyed the colony's buildings, supplies, and crops. It might even have made portions of Roanoke Island temporarily uninhabitable through flooding or storm surge. There's some historical support for this. Spanish records from 1588 mention a great storm that damaged Spanish ships in the Caribbean and affected the North American coast. If this storm struck Roanoke, it could have forced the colonists to relocate immediately. However, hurricanes leave evidence: destroyed trees, altered coastlines, deposits of marine sediments far inland. Archaeologists have found no clear geological evidence of a catastrophic hurricane strike at Roanoke during the 1587-1590 period. Earthquakes are another possibility, though less likely. The region does experience seismic activity occasionally. A significant earthquake could have damaged structures, contaminated water sources, or made the island feel unsafe. But again, there's no geological evidence of a major earthquake during the relevant period. The most likely explanation is that multiple factors combined to determine the colonists' fate. The severe drought created food and water crises. Disease killed some colonists. Fear of Spanish or Native American attack motivated relocation. The colony split into groups pursuing different survival strategies. Some groups successfully integrated with native communities and survived. Others died from disease, starvation, violence, or a combination of threats. This isn't a single dramatic event. It's a cascade of challenges that a small, isolated, undersupplied community couldn't overcome through English methods alone. Survival required adaptation. For some colonists, that meant abandoning English identity and becoming part of Native American society. For others, it meant death. The word Croatoan, carved into that post, might not have been the colony's full story. It might have been one group's message, the people who went south with Manteo. Other groups left different traces or no traces at all. History demands neat narratives. We want clear causes and definitive explanations. But the truth of the lost colony is probably messy, complex, and irreducible to a single cause. 117 people faced multiple simultaneous threats in a harsh environment, isolated from support, with limited resources and knowledge. Some survived through assimilation. Some died. The proportions we will likely never know with certainty. What we can say is this: the colonists weren't passive victims of mysterious forces. They made choices. They adapted. They struggled. And in struggling, they changed, becoming something neither fully English nor fully Native American, but something new born from necessity. And in that transformation, they became lost to the records and categories that define history, not because they vanished, but because they became uncategorizable. Chapter 5. Croatoan, the legacy of America's first mystery. 438 years after 117 English colonists vanished into the wilderness of coastal North Carolina, we still speak their names. Eleanor Dare, Ananias Dare, Virginia Dare, Manteo, John White. These people have been dead for centuries, yet they remain vividly present in American consciousness. The lost colony of Roanoke has become more than history. It has become myth, symbol, cultural touchstone. It appears in novels, films, television shows, and conspiracy theories. It inspires archaeological expeditions and genetic studies. It draws tourists to North Carolina's Outer Banks, where the fort has been reconstructed, and the outdoor drama, The Lost Colony, has been performed every summer since 1937, except during World War II and the COVID-19 pandemic. But why? Why does this particular colonial failure captivate us when countless other early settlements also failed? What makes the lost colony so enduringly fascinating? And what does our obsession with solving this mystery reveal about ourselves? Human beings crave explanations. We are pattern-seeking creatures who become deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity. Unsolved mysteries create a kind of cognitive dissonance. Our brains demand closure that reality refuses to provide. The Roanoke mystery has perfect structure for maximum intrigue. It begins with hope. Families seeking new lives, a baby born, a colony established. It contains a forced separation. John White departing against his will. It includes a terrible delay, years passing while White desperately tries to return. And it culminates in discovery of absence, the empty settlement, the single carved word, the unanswered questions. This narrative arc feels almost designed for storytelling. But it's real. These weren't characters in a novel. They were actual human beings whose actual lives ended in ways we cannot fully reconstruct. That combination of genuine historical reality and profound uncertainty creates psychological power. We can research. We can theorize. We can excavate and analyze DNA. But we can never definitively know what Eleanor Dare thought as she gave birth to Virginia. We can never know what the colonists discussed before deciding to leave Roanoke. We can never know Virginia Dare's fate with absolute certainty. This unknowability is both frustrating and strangely compelling. It leaves room for imagination, for projection, for each generation to interpret the mystery through its own cultural lens. How Americans have understood the lost colony reveals much about America itself. In the early 19th century, writers portrayed the colonists as tragic victims of savage wilderness, a narrative that justified westward expansion by depicting the American frontier as inherently dangerous and in need of civilizing by white settlers. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Virginia Dare became a racial symbol. She was portrayed as a pure white child lost to an inferior culture, a fantasy that reflected anxieties about immigration, racial mixing, and cultural change. Some white supremacists literally used Virginia Dare as a symbol of white racial purity, supposedly threatened by non-white populations. This racial interpretation was historically nonsensical. If the colonists integrated with Native Americans, They were engaging in exactly the kind of cultural and likely genetic mixing that these racist narratives claimed to oppose. But myth is never constrained by logic. In the mid-20th century, as historical scholarship became more rigorous, interpretations shifted. The colonists were increasingly understood as real people facing practical challenges: food shortages, disease, isolation, rather than symbolic figures in morality tales about race or civilization. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with greater respect for Native American perspectives, scholars began framing assimilation not as tragedy, but as pragmatic survival strategy. Joining the Croatoan wasn't cultural defeat, it was adaptation. The colonists hadn't been destroyed by the wilderness. They had learned from people who understood how to live in that environment. Most recently, genetic research and indigenous voices have added crucial perspective. For the Lumbee people, the lost colony isn't lost at all. It's part of their ancestry. Their elders have been saying this for centuries. Now, science increasingly supports their oral traditions. So after 438 years of investigation, what can we say with confidence? We know the colonists faced multiple simultaneous challenges: severe drought, hostile tribes, limited supplies, isolation and disease. We know they left Roanoke Island deliberately, not fleeing in panic but methodically dismantling structures and leaving messages. We know they indicated they were going to Croatoan Island, home of Manteo's people. We know that archaeological evidence of English presence has been found both on Croatoan Island and in inland sites approximately 50 miles from Roanoke. We know genetic evidence suggests some modern Lumbee people carry European DNA markers consistent with late 16th century English ancestry. We know linguistic analysis reveals archaic English patterns preserved in Lumbee speech. We know from historical documents that early 17th century English explorers repeatedly heard reports of English-speaking, European-featured people living among Native American tribes in interior North Carolina. We know these reports describe people who knew about books, Christianity, and English customs, knowledge that would have come from actual English colonists or their immediate descendants. Taken together, this evidence strongly suggests that substantial numbers of Roanoke colonists survived by integrating into Native American communities. Some probably went to Croatoan Island. Others probably relocated inland. Over time, they intermarried, had children, and their distinct English identity gradually faded into hybrid communities. But we cannot prove this happened to all 117 colonists. Some might have died from disease, starvation, or violence. Some might have attempted to sail for England and drowned. Some might have been killed by Spanish forces or hostile tribes. The fate of every individual person will likely never be known. If Roanoke colonists did survive and assimilate, their descendants almost certainly live today. The genetic evidence, while not conclusive, points to the Lumbee people as the most likely group to carry Roanoke ancestry. For many Lumbee people, this isn't theory, it's family tradition. They know their ancestors included English colonists. They preserve stories passed down through generations. They point to family resemblances, surnames, and cultural practices that reflect English heritage. But proving specific lineages is almost impossible. 400 years of intermarriage and migration have made genetic signals extremely complex. Genealogical records from the 16th and 17th centuries are fragmentary. And critically, many Lumbee people question whether proving European ancestry should even be a priority. They are Native Americans, regardless of whether some distant ancestors came from England. This raises profound questions about identity. If you are descended from both English colonists and Native Americans, which identity takes precedence? How do you honor both heritages? What does it mean to be descended from people who crossed cultural boundaries so completely that their original identity disappeared? These aren't just historical questions. They're deeply personal questions for real people trying to understand their own heritage. The word Croatoan, carved into that wooden post in 1587 or 1588, has taken on layers of meaning far beyond its original intent. As a geographical location, it indicated where the colonists had gone, to Croatoan Island, among Manteo's people. As a message to John White, it was practical information. We went here, come find us here, we are safe. But because White never did find them, Croatoan transformed from a message into a mystery. The word itself became eerie, enigmatic, almost supernatural. It appears in Edgar Allan Poe's final delirious words before death, though that story is probably apocryphal. It appears in H.P. Lovecraft's horror fiction as a cursed word. It has been used in countless supernatural TV shows, horror movies, and conspiracy theories. This transformation, from geographical name to mysterious symbol, reflects how historical events become mythology. The actual practical meaning gets obscured by layers of interpretation, speculation, and cultural projection. Today, Croatoan means different things to different people. To historians, it's a crucial clue in a historical puzzle. To the Croatoan Indian tribe, who took their name from their ancestral island, it's part of their identity and heritage. To popular culture, it's a spooky word associated with disappearance and mystery. To tourists visiting Fort Raleigh, it's the dramatic centerpiece of the lost colony story. All these meanings coexist. None completely captures the original intent of whoever carved that word into wood more than 4 centuries ago. If there's a lesson to take from the lost colony, perhaps it's this. Survival sometimes requires becoming something new. The English colonists who arrived at Roanoke in 1587 believed they would establish an English settlement in the New World, maintaining their language, customs, religion, and identity, while simply transplanting them to a new location. They thought they could remain purely English while living in North America. That proved impossible. The environment was different. The political situation was different. The existing inhabitants had their own cultures, knowledge, and ways of life. For the colonists to survive, they needed to adapt, to learn, to compromise, to change. Those who successfully adapted likely survived. Those who rigidly insisted on doing things the English way, growing English crops in unfamiliar soil during a catastrophic drought, maintaining English isolation from the native communities who knew how to find food and water, probably didn't survive. This is not unique to Roanoke. It's the pattern of American history. Successful settlements learned from Native Americans how to grow corn, how to hunt local game, how to navigate waterways, how to survive winters. Unsuccessful settlements stubbornly insisted on European methods that didn't work in the New World. Jamestown, founded in 1607, nearly failed completely because colonists initially refused to farm, expecting to find gold instead. They survived only after John Smith imposed discipline and after they learned agricultural techniques from the Powhatan people. Plymouth Colony survived because the Wampanoag people taught them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer and how to hunt and gather local foods. Without that indigenous knowledge transfer, the Pilgrims would have starved. The Roanoke colonists appear to have learned this lesson faster and more completely. Instead of maintaining separation from native peoples while accepting minimal help, they apparently chose full integration. They became part of native communities, and in doing so they survived, even though they ceased to be distinctly English. Did the lost colony fail or succeed? By the standards of its sponsors in England, it failed completely. It didn't establish a permanent English settlement. It didn't generate profits. It didn't advance England's colonial claims. It disappeared without even providing useful information about why it failed. But by the standards of survival, the most fundamental human goal, it arguably succeeded. The colonists didn't die. They adapted. They found a way to live in a challenging environment by joining people who already knew how to thrive there. Their descendants likely walked the earth for generations, carrying forward genes, stories, and memories from both English and Native American ancestors. We call them the lost colony. But perhaps they were never lost. Perhaps they were found by the Croatoan people, who welcomed them, fed them, married them, and absorbed them into communities that had lived on that land for thousands of years. Perhaps what was lost wasn't the colonists themselves, but only our ability to categorize them neatly as English. They became something else, something hybrid, something new. And perhaps that's the real story of America. Not pure cultures transplanted unchanged from Europe, but constant mixing, adaptation, and transformation, creating something that had never existed before. Conclusion. Today on Roanoke Island, Fort Raleigh stands reconstructed on the original settlement site. A museum displays artifacts. Historical markers tell the story. Every summer, actors perform The Lost Colony, dramatizing the mystery for audiences who come seeking answers to questions that may never be fully answered. The word Croatoan, carved in wood 4 centuries ago, has been carved again in stone memorials, printed in countless books, typed into millions of internet searches, spoken in documentaries and classrooms and tourist centers. 117 people, men, women, and children, lived, struggled, and made choices we can only partially reconstruct. They faced challenges we can barely imagine. They left traces we are still discovering. They deserve to be remembered not as mysterious disappearances, but as human beings who adapted, survived, and became part of something larger than themselves. Their story isn't finished. Archaeological excavations continue, genetic studies expand, historical research deepens. Each generation rediscovers the lost colony and asks the question, what happened at Roanoke? The answer perhaps is simpler than we imagine. They lived, they survived, they became American, and in becoming American, truly American, mixing European and indigenous heritage, they became invisible to the categories and records that defined English colonists. Lost to history, but not to life. Their legacy lives on, in the Lumbee people who claim them as ancestors, in the archaeological sites that preserve their artifacts, in the DNA that carries forward fragments of their genetic code, and in our enduring fascination with their story. Croatoan, a word, a place, a people, a mystery, a legacy. The lost colony endures because their story is our story, the story of transformation, adaptation, and survival in a new world.